Welcome to the Theology for Our Times podcast. On this episode, we have Dr. Willie James Jennings, who is the Andrew Mellon Professor of Systematic Theology and Africana Studies at Yale Divinity School. He's here for a couple of weeks in Princeton giving the Warfield lectures at Princeton Theological Seminary, and he'll be interviewed by a guest host, Elise, who's a professor of religion at Baylor University, working in the area of Christian ethics and architecture. She's also a CTI member who's here for the entire academic year working on our project on From Despair to Hope. And Elise, Dr. Edwards, has been attending Dr. Jennings' lectures at Princeton Seminary and is looking forward to interviewing him. So I want to welcome both of these guests to the show.
Welcome, Willie Jennings.
Thank you.
It is great to be here with you.
Dr. Edwards, what a joy for me to be in your presence.
Oh, you're so gracious, as always. Well, you're here in Princeton for the 2026 Annie Kincaid Warfield Lecture Series at Princeton Theological Seminary. This lecture series, which you've titled Only Then Will We Build, Forming a Real Doctrine of Creation, explores what is required for Christians to recover what is often missing, a doctrine of creation that does real work in the world. Across 6 lectures, you offer a tentative map of the theological, ethical, and communal terrains we must traverse in order to build thriving life together in the presence and love of the triune God. So let me begin there. Why do we need a new or better doctrine of creation? What work should the doctrine of creation be doing for us, and what's wrong with existing frameworks?
Well, thank you for the question, and it's such a joy to be here with you to have this time to talk. Christian doctrines of creation, in many ways, have never got launched off the ground, or should I say, have never come to the ground. Especially within the last several hundred years, they have been obsessed, and I do mean obsessed, with questions of origins. Now, of course, the word creation does lend itself to asking the big question about where we're from, which is a valid question. But a Christian doctrine of creation doesn't begin with the question of origins. It begins with life on the ground. And it begins with the God, in a sense, taking us by the hand and saying, I want you to look around at the ground, and I want you to look at yourself, and then I want you to smile.
Yeah.
So the fundamental problem of Christian doctrines of creation is that they're really not about creation. They're about ideas, speculations about where we came from and how God had something to do with our very beginnings. Now, of course, God has everything to do with our very beginnings, but there's a way in which Christian thought, Christian life, the Christian tradition, what we understand about the life of God, wants to bring us into those questions about our beginnings. So my goal is to try to put the doctrine where it has never really lived, in how we live in the world, on the ground, in place, with plants and animals, how we build life together, literally build life together, not just theoretically, but literally build life together. And then what kind of life of flourishing, thriving, does a Christian vision of creation commend to us in our everyday realities?
Yeah, now you know I am deeply invested in these questions
Yes, you
as
are.
well. And I can recall when I was doing work on my last project, my book project on theology, ethics, and architecture.
A fabulous book, by the way.
Thank you, which you blurbed. I appreciate that. But I remember when I was doing that work and I was looking at doctrines of creation, that seemed like a natural starting point. I couldn't find the kind of resources I was looking for. And it's because I think this different sense of, to me, what the word creation meant and what I was finding in the literature, which I think is what you're talking about, is this obsession with origins.
Yeah.
So what does creation actually mean for you? What kinds of creation are you talking about? Are you talking about the distinction between creator and creatures, or are you talking about the process of making, which includes creativity? What to you is creation about, or what
Yeah.
can you specify that term for us a little more?
And it's all those things you mentioned and more. But I think the most important thing that's at the heart of it, it's coming to realize our destiny to be with God in the dirt. And that is such a profound thing for us to present as Christians, that God loves us in the dirt.
Yeah.
And what that means is that it's simply not God loving us in the dirt, but God coming alongside of us, wanting to create new life with us through the dirt.
Yeah.
And if we could grasp the significance of that, it aligns all the other beliefs that are a part of Christian life in the right direction. That the life with God that God has made possible through the incarnation is not to, as many people understand, not to spirit us away from the earth into some place called heaven somewhere else, but it's the recreation of it. And that recreation, in fact, begins with God drawing us into all the beauties of our creative powers. So creation is this life of communion, relationship that is opening up into a life of building, what I call is the artisanal calling of life, to create, to weave, to build life with others, to build new story, and to build new places, new habitation, new dwelling.
Yeah.
That's what's so exciting. That's what a doctrine of creation should be about. It should let people envision their life in place.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm so excited about this work you're doing. And it a couple of days ago in your lecture on assimilating desire, you began to talk about these relations that we have. You describe a grammar of animality found in Acts 10 that weaves land, animals, and people together. How does this grammar challenge the theological segregation that often separates our doctrinal teachings from biblical engagement, from historical grounding, from ethics, or even, I say this as an ethicist, social ethics from environmental ethics, right? Or various kinds of ethical paths of inquiry.
This is a great question. And it all comes back to overcoming what I call the deep problem of displacement. That we have been shaped, especially in the modern period, to see ourselves really not in place. The great anthropologist Keith Bossel had the phrase that people are geographically adrift. And what he meant by that is place plays no significant role in how we understand ourselves and our actions. And so the kinds of separations that we live in terms of the way we think, the way we act, the old separations between doing, being, and thinking, are all tied to, at heart, a reality of displacement. So that place is absolutely inconsequential. Now, why is that so important? Because if we thought about our life in place in its deepest moral and ethical dimensions, then what we would be are people who think about what does it mean to live faithfully in this place with others. The great anthropologist, Arturo Escobar, he made the statement that, and this is from spending many years with indigenous peoples in Bolivia and Colombia, he said that a person's sense of relationality is based on their sense of connectivity. So if I have a very thin, weak sense of connectivity to land, to place, to the animals, to the immediate environment that I live in, then my sense of relationality will also be very shallow, because I will see no ethical requirements of how I should be with you based on where I am. And so this is, in a sense, deep problem for us because our ethics, our moral vision, in many ways, it just comes out of our own sense of volition. That's the only thing that's driving how I should behave. And there's nothing about the place that says to me, I need to behave differently. I need to respect not only this land, but the people who move across it. And my moral responsibilities reach beyond my property line.
Yeah.
And that's the most difficult thing, I think, for us to understand. As I've said in my lectures, we have been shaped by the line, Dr. Edwards, the line, the property line. And for so many of us, that line is not simply outside of us, it's inside of us. So we do not understand any kind of ethical responsibility, any kind of moral vision that reaches beyond what is ours. What's our own property, what's our own city, what's our own country. Any place else, that's somebody else's business. Mm-hmm. Which means that we have a morality that is fundamentally displaced. It lives in no place.
Yeah. So in contrast to that, there's something I heard you mention many years ago at a lecture. This was after the publication of The Christian Imagination, your book on theology and the origins of race. You gave a statement similar to one I heard you repeat a couple of days ago, that there's something that we, as modern Christians, can learn from missionaries and others who were said to have gone native.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That there's that I'm imagining is a kind of the opposite or an alternative to this displaced theology. What is it that we can learn from them, and can you use this to draw a connective thread between that book, The Christian Imagination, and your forthcoming work on the doctrine of creation?
The thing that we have to learn, and it's unfortunate that most Christians have not learned it because, as I've said many times, those reports, those stories, those testimonies, those lives were hidden and lost, sometimes on purpose. And what are we talking about? We're talking about people who came to new lands and new peoples with the first idea that they were going to change them, make them Christian, civilize them, bring them into a different way of life, primarily the European way of life. And when they got there, they realized that all of that was wrong. That in order to be a Christian in a new place, one has to become one with the people and the place. So rather than first the missionary converting the people converted the missionary. Mm-hmm. And so his way of being with people and with the land became one with the people. And for so many peoples, that to become one with them is to become one with the way in which they understand their lives, inextricably bound with the place, with the water, with the lands, with the animals, with the way they hunt, the way they gather food, the way they cook, their rituals. And what those missionaries realized is that in order to be Christian, they had to show their love of God through their love of people and place. And that love would, in a sense, rewrite for them what it means to be Christian in that moment, in that place. Now, of course, this was far too radical. It has always been far too radical for so many Christian institutions. Why? Because all of a sudden, what it means to be Christian carries an incredible question to everyone. And that question is, how must you change to be Christian by changing among the people with whom you will be Christian? Now that, of course, that means that what it means to be a Christian is, first of all, to be a learner. It's to assimilate. That's the word I used in my first lecture. It's to become one with the ways of a people in a land. This is the opposite of the kind of Christianity most of us have inherited. We were presented with a Christianity that understands itself, its primary disposition is teacher. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake even if we understand the very founding of Christianity in the incarnate life of God. God became flesh, and as a 2-year-old, did not start teaching. As an 8-year-old, did not start writing books. That God came as a learner, and yet was God. God came as one receiving, one entering in. Let's even use the word assimilating. God came as one to be one among us. And as a learner, God then, as a learner, gave witness to the life of God in the flesh. Now, why is that so radical? Because it means that it is possible to be an Orthodox, confessing Christian and not say a word. It is possible to articulate your faith, not by how you talk, but by how you listen. It is possible to present a faith that changes and yet is even more that faith. This is what's missing. But what is all this based on? How deeply we can listen to people and listen to the land that they inhabit, and to learn with them and through them what it means to live in a place.
That is very profound, and reminds me of a conversation I would have with my students sometimes, where we would talk about Jesus as a young person. We were talking about learning, right, as professors do with their students, right? And this sense of, I was trying to help my students understand that, making mistakes or the learning process is never just about starting from, zero. You've talked about 0-point thinking.
Yes.
Starting from zero and then somehow arriving at the end perfectly formed. Yes. That it's a process of learning is a process of discovery in which we have setbacks and move forward. Absolutely. And I say, do you think that Jesus, as a baby learning to walk, never stumbled, or that when he spoke, he never said the wrong word, or these various things are just inherently part of the learning process. I said, do you think that if he had been given quizzes that he would always get 100%? That's not what it means to be human and to be a learner. And if we truly believe that he's human, fully human, then that means he learns the same way we do.
Absolutely.
And to then connect that to the divine, that God becomes human, so that God becomes a learner as well. It's very profound. Let me connect to this point you mentioned about transformation. You in one of your lectures, you had a lecture, your second lecture, titled "Contemplating Connection." This was focused on how we perceive our bond with creation and with one another. I find your word choice here to be very compelling. You spoke of contemplating connection rather than seeing a connection or drawing a connection. And as a self-described contemplative Christian, contemplative Baptist to be specific,
that's wonderful.
This language of contemplation really stood out to me because it frames contemplation as a pathway to connection.
Yeah.
Now, some religious traditions, especially the way that it often gets presented in Western Christianity, treat contemplation as a private interior journey toward personal peace. How does your doctrine of creation shift contemplation into a communal or political act that helps us recover connections that racial and colonial logics have historically severed?
Oh, that's a great question. I want very much to take the genius of the contemplative tradition that's in Christianity and allow it to come fully to the ground. The image I used in my lectures was that tradition in all its beauty is like raised beds in a garden. Now, raised beds in a garden are lovely, but they're raised beds.
Right.
And so what I want us to do is to imagine not raised beds, but the contemplative life fully back on the ground. Now, of course, we know in gardening, many times you do raised beds to help protect it so that it can grow properly and keep certain kind of animals out. But in our case, those raised beds are tied to some of the problems of displacement, some of the problems of not understanding what it means to enter the lives of other people. And so what we want is a reality of contemplation that understands that God is doing this when we contemplate the divine life. As we're contemplating the divine life, God comes to us and puts God's arms around us and says, look at the dirt. Look at the dirt. And we find that with Jesus. Jesus said, I mentioned this in my lecture last night, you have heard it said, but I say to you, consider the lilies. And so we want a contemplation that not only turns us back to considering the creation, but considering the creation not like we're looking at a still life, but we're contemplating and listening. We're recognizing its animate and communicative dimensions. But here it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. We're also listening to those who can help us learn how to listen better. So it's a contemplative life that is in the multitude and of the multitude that recognizes this is where God is. And even if we think about the beautiful monastic tradition of, desert fathers and mothers, as they talked about being with God in the desert is very much present. Right. God is there in the desert. And so what we want is a vision of contemplation that does this incredible work, that it's taking us more and more tightly into the interwoven nature of our creatureliness. And why is that so important? Because then we have even a better sense of how God is caressing us in our creatureliness. In our creatureliness. And so a reality of contemplation that does that work allows the world in all its manifold beauty and majesty to do its work with us. What is that? If God is caressing us through the creation is also caressing us. And so a contemplative life is a life that is learning how to be even more attuned with the caressing reality of the world all around us. Mm. That is not in competition with, but is collaborating with God's own touch of us, right?
Yeah, that gives me so much to think about, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. It really helps ground this understanding of being placed, right?
Yes,
and being connected, as you talk about.
This podcast is brought to you by the Center of Theological Inquiry, Princeton, New Jersey. CTI is a non-profit institution dedicated to advanced research in theology. Our mission is to cultivate a theological renaissance for church, university, culture, and society. All our activities are funded through grants or charitable donations. So if you like what you have heard and wish to help us realize our mission, please do consider making a donation in support of our work. Check out our website, ctinquiry.org, to learn more.
In your third lecture, you drew upon Tim Ingold's distinction mm-hmm. between wayfaring
yes.
and something like transport, suggesting that wayfaring that wayfaring is this understanding of lines that's different from the line that most of us have internalized, right? That these wayfaring lines form knots of meaning rather than modular destinations.
Yes.
Right. So I have in my mind an image of a web,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Of these strands
Yes.
that are then connected at this tangle or this knot of place.
Yeah.
If we take this seriously, how should it change the way a faith community thinks about physical places?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking of things like church buildings
Yes.
or
Yes.
church property.
Yes.
Can a church or a building be reimagined as a knot in this wayfaring schema rather than an enclosed destination?
Yeah.
And this is a question I'm asking, having in mind a very practical, real world issue
Yeah.
right now, which is a lot of churches dealing with buildings that they
Yes.
can no longer
Yes.
afford to maintain, or that the congregation size is so much smaller than what that building was designed for, and so the sense of their identity as church is being wrapped up with this building, right?
Yeah.
So I'm asking you, can wayfaring, this way of thinking, help us understand church or building as a knot rather than an enclosed destination, and what that might mean?
That's a great question. So for your listeners, this is such an important thing that we gain from the anthropologist Tim Ingold. And it's inside his diagnosis of our problem that he calls inversion. And briefly what that means is that we have been shaped, we moderns as it were, we have been shaped to think of ourselves as living on the surface of the world. That we kind of like we're wheels just kind of moving from place to place. And so the idea that most of us that's inside of us as we think about our movements, it's transport. We're transporting our bodies and our things from one destination, one dot to another dot. And the movement between them is inconsequential because I'm trying to get to the other spot. Whether I'm on a train, a plane, a bus, the point is to get me where I need to go as quickly as I can. And that idea of transport, while we may glory in what that means for efficiency and so forth, what's lost is a sense of our being not only in place, but moving not on the surface of a place, but in and through a place. And so wayfaring is a way, in a sense, to bring us back to the logic of what walking really points to. When you walk, you notice, you sense, you see, but most importantly, you realize that you are on the ground. And that recognition is not simply just a light observation. It shapes the way you understand your life. We are lines. We leave lines. So if we're walking through a dirt road or some road that we leave footsteps, we leave a line. And what Ingold is saying is that, in a sense, we are our lines, our movements back and forth through place. Now, why that is so significant is that it helps us see that we are not simply on a place. We're in a place, and the place is in us. Now, to bring into what you just said about churches, this is so important because, as I like to say, if we don't have a doctrine of creation, which we don't, we Christians, we certainly don't have healthy ecclesiologies, that is, visions of churches. Because if you don't have a doctrine of creation, you can't have a healthy vision of church. And I know for many of the listeners, they'll be like, what do you mean we don't have a healthy vision of church? Our vision of church is as displaced as is our vision of our bodies. So for so many people, especially now, where they live and where they go to church, two totally different things. Mm-hmm. Where the church is and the church's connection to the life around it is minimal. And so for many people, because they're not embedded in place, embedded in the ground, that their lives are not, in a sense, traversing through the places that they are in, the church isn't a knot where lines are meeting. The church is just a catching station of those rolling balls that have been transported there. So for a lot of churches, where they are is inconsequential. I often ask people in churches, why is this church here? And they'll give me some big theological answer because God created it. No, I'm not asking why the church exists. And I'll say, why is this church here? And then they'll give me history. Well, back in, such and we got this land. Okay, but that's not the answer. Why are you, church, in this place? And most churches don't have an answer. Yeah. They are in a building, but they are not in a place.
Yeah.
And so the challenge is for churches, before they sell their land, which is a crisis at this moment. As many of us know, right now, the largest land transfer in the history of the world is happening, as churches, Protestant, Catholic, et al., are selling their land to developers, and in many cases, without any kind of moral or theological vision for what they're doing. They're just trying to survive, which is tragic. But what churches have to do, every church now, the church needs to gather and ask the fundamental question: what is God calling us to do and be in this community? And I don't mean by that, what kind of programs should we do in the community? Yes, we want that, but how are we going to live in this community? Live in this community. And if you can't live in the community, well, now that's a serious question. But wayfaring means that my movements that constitute the lines of my life, that then intersect with other lines, at that intersection is church, which means I'm living in this place. And out of this place, my moral vision, my vision of discipleship, this is where it is. This is where it lives and is embodied.
Is wayfaring then possible for a church that is primarily online, right? So this is one of the developments that we've seen, certainly post-COVID, but it began before that.
Yeah.
And for some, it's a response to this question about church property, right?
Yes.
Of churches moving into the virtual space, so they're virtual church. Is it possible to do wayfaring as a virtual church or any kind of virtual community, a virtual seminary or a virtual theological think tank, right? How does wayfaring connect to virtual gathering?
Yeah, this is one of the big questions we're facing, and we can expand it into the kind of most pressing question. Is displacement a problem that we can solve? And here we have to recognize what we're in the midst of, good doctor. And what are we in the midst of? The increased inconsequentiality of our being in place. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter where we are. It doesn't matter what's happening on the ground around us, because I'm really a disconnected person. I'm geographically adrift. So to answer your question, movement is always possible, but wayfaring means that I am committed to being in a place and allowing the place to be in me. This is the thing that's missing for us. We have been shaped, and this has been a trajectory, in a sense, from the very beginning of turning the world into private property and territory and border. We have been placed on a trajectory in which the world is nothing more than a stage. Nothing more than a stage. And so this place is just the same as that place, is just the same as that place. And in fact, we have to pause and think about what that means for our life. As so many of us know, I can move anywhere as long as I have my Starbucks, my Trader Joe's, my Costco, and you add to the list. It doesn't matter what the place is. What about the trees and the fauna and the mountains and all that? I got my Trader Joe's, Starbucks, Costco. There's something deeply, deeply flawed about a way of life that is shaped in that way.
Yeah.
But for so many people, for me to even say that sounds strange. What do you mean? What's strange about that?
Yeah, it sounds almost too romantic in a way, right? That we can't have that kind of existence. But you are challenging us to think through the profound implications of that. You said the other day that we will never have a doctrine of creation as long as we are committed to the sense of ownership or owned existence, as you called it, engendered by this line that you were talking about, this line that we use to create, that this line that creates property, that creates prison, border, territory, that will never have a doctrine of creation as long as we are committed to owned existence.
Right.
So how does this distort a proper Christian relationship to others, to self, to land, to God? This sense of owned existence.
Yeah. This is one of the fundamental problems that we're facing, and for so many people, it's a part of what I call the remade world, and the remade world is a world in which we believe it may be possessed. At the heart of the biblical witness, when God says to God's people, biblical Israel, you are on this land, God is clear to say, now this is mine, not yours. And the mine doesn't mean that God is the only property owner. It means that God isn't looking at this like property. Mm-hmm. Another way to say that, God is saying, this world and me, we're connected. And so no, you'll never own it because it's now a part of the divine life. And so the idea that we can slice and dice and carve up the world and that each of us can own a little piece is not only a fundamentally flawed possibility, because that can't be, but it's also a flawed vision of what the body is and what land is. So to say that we could never have a doctrine of creation as long as we have a vision of property means that the idea of property and ownership literally, spiritually speaking, blinds us from seeing the world as alive and animate, which means it blinds us from seeing our activities as doing nothing more than enslaving the world, turning it into a slave. And so many people, as we know, they treat the world like it is a slave.
Yeah.
So for Christians to be so deeply committed to property ownership, to property relations, I don't think what they realize is that it's a fundamental flaw in their faith. You cannot. Now, in the remade world, this is how we live.
It's how we survive.
It's how we
How we
survive.
build wealth.
But in the remade world, what we must do is ask this fundamental question. While we are in it, how is God asking us to crumble it from within? Mm-hmm. Right? God crumbles things from within. Crumbles slavery from within. Crumbles patriarchy from within. Crumbles it. Now, what do I mean by that? And there is something that is so present in the biblical witness to show us how it crumbles from within. It's one word, Dr. Edwards. What's that word? Sharing. Sharing. Why? Because sharing crumbles it from within. we must always remember Zacchaeus and that tree, right? I love that story because it comes to exactly what we're talking about. Zacchaeus climbs that tree, that sycamore tree. And we know those sycamore trees were known for their giving, not only the beautiful shade they gave, but the fruiting ones, the wonderful fruit that they gave. And so Zacchaeus, ironically, is in a sycamore tree trying to find Jesus. And in the story, it's so beautifully laid out. When he descends from the sycamore tree and he stands before Jesus, and Jesus says, I'm going to now be with you. What comes out of his mouth? He's a tax collector. Everybody knows he's a sinner. It's one of the only places in the Bible where someone by name is called a sinner. Zacchaeus, yep, he is a sinner. Everybody agrees on that. But what comes out of his mouth as this wealthy tax collector is exactly what we want to hear. Lord, I will give half of what I have to the poor. That's the first thing. That's not the only thing. If I have defrauded anyone, if you're a tax collector, of course you have. If, he says, I will give 4 times as much back. That's reparations.
Yeah.
4 times. I'm not saying I'm going to give him 4 times as much. Now, between giving half and giving 4 times as much, that's not leaving a whole lot. So ownership with Zacchaeus is crumbling from within. So what does that mean for Christians who want to hold on to property, who believe in property relations? The call to you is the word of Zacchaeus, right? Now, if we have to exist inside this remade world with its property relations, we give witness to a different way of being inside of it. That once you step inside with us, it's no longer the remade world. It's a different world.
And to me, that sounds very much like what the gospel is about. It's about a calling to a different way of being in this world, aligned with the kingdom of God, not with the systems of this remade world.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You've noted that we often internalize these logics, though, or that we have internalized this logic of owned existence, this logic of the line, so deeply that we see ourselves as possessions, or we see others as possessions. And for Christians, we read the Bible and practice our faith within a sense of owned existence, where thriving is tied to owning and controlling more. If we move outside of this ownership logic, what happens to the concept of stewardship? So many of us who care about the environment and about addressing climate crisis have connected our work in some way to this idea of stewardship. How does that become part of this, or is that part of this internalized logic?
Yeah. I've never been a fan of stewardship, the idea, because it does work inside, in a sense, property relations. Now, you can envision a reality of care that I think stewardship wants to get at, that a reality of care that doesn't really need the concept of stewardship. It's a reality of care that's inside communion, inside partnership, inside family. So let's think of care like we would of our family members. Now, we could bring the word stewardship to caring for our family, but that's not quite a match with what's happening here. Care indicates a reciprocal reality, a participation, a recognition that I'm not only offering care, but I'm receiving from you care. That I'm not only giving love, but I'm receiving love. And I think that's how we want to think about the creation, that we are involved in a web of care, a reciprocity. I talk about a perceptual reciprocity, that we learn to look alongside other people's. And I think that's what we want. We want a vision of care that doesn't require ownership, but does require giving.
Yeah. So does the concept of creation care more align with this, or?
Yeah, I think we can work with creation care. It tends not to have a lot of. It doesn't fire the imagination,
Right.
and it tends to get woven back into stewardship,
Right.
because it's like caring for your yard at the start of the spring season, right? Or picking up leaves, that kind of care. But we're talking about something else. We're talking about when you go outside and you are simply, you've had a very tough moment, and being outside and the wind blows through the trees and it also blows across your face. And you hear the leaves dancing in the wind and the sunlight coming through the branches, striking your face. And inside of that, you feel better. And in return, you promise, I'm going to always care for this space. That's the image we want. It's care received that then draws the desire to care. That's the kind of image we want.
Yeah, so reciprocity
Yes,
is
yes,
at the heart of that.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So you've spoken about how 0-point thinking, this hubris of thinking from nowhere, right, as opposed to being placed and deeply connected to place, how that 0-point thinking infects our knowledge making.
Right.
How can the discipline of theology move toward a perceptual reciprocity from this 0-point thinking, or abandoning this 0-point thinking? How can we move toward a perceptual reciprocity that acknowledges we are always in places, we are always reading after others, and as you are provoking us to especially attune our reading practices after those whose lives and bodies are most bound to the dirt of a specific place.
Yeah.
What does this mean for theology as a discipline?
This is such a great question. And for your listeners, 0-point thinking comes from a number of Latin American thinkers. And it has to do with how the colonialists, when they came, imagined that all thinking began with them. And out of that, true knowledge emerged. And so for Christians to be inside that same tragedy, it gets back to what we talked about earlier, Christians thinking themselves as first teachers, who are going to teach the correct way about God, teach the correct way to God, rather than being learners. And so to understand ourselves as learners means that theology begins in the listening, just as the God we serve and we write about and think about began in the listening. This is missing from so much theology. The very idea that we listen first to what others can teach us about what it means to be in the dirt, that becomes the basis of how we not only understand who we are, but we understand who God is a radical idea. But it is fundamental to even how we understand what Jesus is doing. My former colleague, Norman Wiersbe, he used to say that if you take away from the Gospels everything that Jesus says that has anything to do with land, dirt, seed, plant, water, air, you have no words of Jesus. Now, what's important about that, the things Jesus is saying, many things he's saying, um, they are born of the land. They're born of the dirt, which means they're born of other people teaching him. His mother holding up a seed and saying, seed, say seed, seed. His father saying, this is a tree, son. His family saying, here, I'll show you how to fish. All of these things are what he learns of the land. But now they're not in competition with the revelation of God that he offers. They're woven together. So theology has forgotten how to do its weaving. Mm. And that's what's missing for so much Christian theology. And by theology, I don't just mean theological studies. I mean the entire work that spans what is theological education and theological work. We have forgotten about the weaving.
So we've mentioned this phrase, or we've talked about dirt quite a bit.
Many times.
But throughout this lecture series, you've been using the phrase bone and dirt.
Yes.
So not just dirt, but bone and dirt to describe our creaturely identity. As we look toward the ideas of sanctuary and living building in your final lectures, how does a bone and dirt creatureliness, a theology that comes out of that bone and dirt creatureliness, shift our vision of community building from the creation of property to the cultivation of creaturely becoming?
That's a great question. I've used these terms, bone and dirt, and my last lecture was discerning bone and dirt. And also the other term I use is dirt flesh. And why both of these are so important is that they help us see not only what should be important to us, but what's important to God. The incarnation, God becoming flesh, is God becoming flesh all the way down to the dirt. God did not become flesh to hover above the dirt. God came flesh. And so what that means is that our bodies are always bone and dirt. And that means it's a discerning of our body consciousness and our land awareness as inextricably intertwined. Now, Dr. Edwards, this is my goal in life, to get people to start to see that how you understand your body and how you are aware of the place and the land you're in need to be brought back together in your thinking about yourself. And the fact that I have to say that points to the depth of the problem we're in the midst of. We know that when we die, we return to the dust, we return to the dirt. We know that our very existence depends on what comes out of the dirt. We know that we could not survive without the dirt, but we have been trained to think of our bodies as separate from the dirt.
Right.
And so discerning bone and dirt, thinking bone and dirt, is to reconnect bodily consciousness and land awareness. But now, to say dirt flesh is so important for us theologically because it does underwrite the reality of God becoming human. That God took on human flesh, and as the church has taught, sinful flesh, our exact flesh. And that flesh is tied to the dirt. Now, being tied to the dirt is not what makes it sinful. Let me be clear. But the fact that God has taken on flesh that goes all the way to the dirt is a profound affirmation and celebration of what God has created. Here's what we always have to remember, and as Christians we forget this. The incarnation is forever. God will always be Mary's baby. God will always be, through all eternity, connected to the dirt. Now, if God has, in a fundamental way, changed the divine life, to be connected to dirt, then dirt flesh is really important.
Yeah.
Because now it is eternal. Now it is within the divine life. And if it isn't within the divine life, we certainly can't own it and treat it like it's a slave. This is now bound to the life of God. This is now life of God. That's why.
Wow. Well, I'm the only question I have to follow that up with is a different kind of question. One reason I always enjoy talking to you or hearing you lecture is that you tie in the work of scholars that are doing amazing work. So I just want to end with this question of what are you reading right now? What is fascinating you? What are you learning from that you could share with the listeners here?
Oh, I'm reading so many wonderful things. So in the last couple of years, I have discovered the poetry of Mary Oliver. Mm-hmm. So I recommend to all your listeners a collection called Devotions of her poetry. It's just fantastic. It's just fantastic. I'm also reading this wonderful book by this scholar who it's a book really on a kind of theopoetics of creation. His name is Van Horn, and I recommend that to your listeners as well. And always, another book of poetry I would recommend is by Kevin Young, his latest collection. Mm. So I'll leave those with you.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time
My
to
pleasure.
talk through these important and complex concepts, but to make them so engaging and stimulating.
You're more than welcome, Doctor.
Thank you.